Being in a shipwreck at sea can increase the danger of a fatal shark attack. The distress signals, chaos, and vulnerability of survivors amid a wreckage is known to attract sharks, mistaking frantic movements or distress signals as signs of wounded prey. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we go over 3 times shipwreck survivors were attacked and eaten alive by sharks. Welcome to Final Affliction. The serene Catalina Channel is a symphony of water and light located in Los Angeles. The ocean here is alive with an abundance of sea life, from playful dolphins to graceful seagulls and pelicans. Since the earliest known time, the channel has been used as a means to connect Santa Catalina Island and the Southern California mainland. Today, the 20-mile-long channel is famous for hosting free diving and swimming competitions, thanks to its clear and shark-free waters. However, in the early 20th century, ruthless predators lurked deep beneath these balmy waters, occasionally rising to the sun-kissed surface to cause havoc in the Catalina Channel. Such was the case with a father and son, whose encounter was one of the most terrifying Los Angeles has ever seen. On Friday, July 27, 1935, Dr. Alfred Wilkes had just finished his shift at Georgia Street Receiving Hospital in Los Angeles, where he worked. His son, 23-year-old Barney Wilkes, left San Pedro for Avalon to meet his father. In the evening, the duo had planned to cross from the Southern California mainland to Santa Catalina Island by boat using the Catalina Channel, also known as the San Pedro Channel. As they unhooked the ropes that tethered their boat securely to the dock, the duo commenced their journey as the sun dipped below the horizon. The boat, now free, bobbed and swayed gently as the ropes were cast away. 58-year-old Dr. Alfred skillfully started the engine, which hacked and sputtered in response. It didn't start. He then hauled the pull start rope, this time around with more effort. The engine hummed and purred to life as the boat sliced through the water. Dr. Alfred carefully guided the boat away from the dock into the Catalina Channel as the harbor and the lights of the shore receded into the distance. The air was thick with the salty scent of the sea, with the sound of the waves and that of the roaring outboard engine as their only company. Their boat was the only sign of life in the entire vastness. To them, it was a humbling experience to be this small in the grand scheme of life and at the mercy of the elements of nature. The choking and spurting of their boat engine as it desperately gulped the last remaining drops of gasoline snapped them out of their reverie. The steady hum of the motor had now changed as the boat began drifting aimlessly. They had forgotten to check the gasoline level while at the dock. The duo exchanged worried glances as their faces twisted in a grimace of frustration. Dr. Alfred tried starting the engine using the pull start rope, but his efforts were fruitless. They had only covered a third of their 20 miles journey. Their hearts sank at the thought of being stranded at night in the middle of the sea. Suddenly, a loud bang interrupted them. There was an explosion at the stern of their boat. A spark had ignited the engine, worsening the situation by multiples. The odds were against them. The explosion had punctured the boat's hull, and water began seeping in. They desperately grabbed anything their hands could reach to stop it. However, no matter how fast their hands moved to scoop the water out, it was gushing in 10 times quicker. They could see the waterline creeping up the sides as the boat started tilting. They tried to patch the holes, but they were large and there was multiple to cover. The boat was becoming more unstable and sinking with every passing second. "We have to jump into the water," said Dr. Alfred, before he stood on the gunwale and jumped off the boat. Barney followed suit as well, lunging himself forward into the water. They watched as their boat took its last tilt before capsizing. Exhausted from removing the water from the boat, The duo agreed swimming to land wasn't an option, and thus decided to cling on the overturned hull, hoping that help would arrive soon. They were now at the mercy of the water current and the chilling night cold. Throughout the night, they held onto the overturned boat, using it as a makeshift life raft as they struggled to keep their heads above water. Drenched and tired, the howling cold winds had them shivering and their teeth chattered as the cold water soaked their bodies to the bones. Soon enough, fatigue began to kick in, and they struggled to stay afloat as their bodies were battered by the dancing waves. They looked at each other. The expressions on their faces showed a mixture of fear and determination. "You have to hold on, son. Help will be here soon," Dr. Alfred encouraged Barney. Their muscles were burning with exhaustion, but they were determined to make it through this test of survival. As the first light of dawn began to peek over the horizon, Dr. Alfred's strength was depreciating. His fingers and arms were numb from holding onto the boat all night long. He was visibly in distress. Barney jumped into action and saved him just before he fell below the water after losing his grasp on the boat. He stood on top of the capsized boat and began pulling him up. However, just before his father was completely out of the water, a shark that had been lurking beneath with its beady eyes set on a possible meal cut the waves and attacked, biting Dr. Alfred's ankle. Barney managed to pull him out before the shark could drag him into the depths. He then scanned the sea and saw nothing but the dancing waves. The shark was nowhere to be seen. Unfortunately, the blood from his father's ankle had stained the water, attracting other sharks. Within no time, there were more than a dozen sharks circling them. As they drew closer, he instinctively tried to pull his fatigued father to the peak of the hull, but Dr. Alfred slipped and fell back into the water. Before Barney could reach him, one of the sharks leaped out of the water with its mouth wide open. Barney's eyes widened in terror as the shark lunged toward him, slamming into the side of the boat. He kicked and punched it with its teeth gnashing inches from his face. He could hear the wood splintering under the force of the shark's attack as it thrashed around. Luckily, the shark abandoned its attack and swam back into the depths, giving Barney a chance to save his drowning father. While laying down on top of the boat and reaching for his father's hand, another shark sunk its serrated teeth into Barney's ankle. He kicked hard, hitting its snout, which prompted it to let go of his leg. He then diverted his attention back to his father and this time successfully pulled him back on top of the hull. As his father's body was pulled out of the water, Barney was horrified to see that one of the sharks had gotten to him and parted with chunks of flesh from his abdomen. Suddenly, the honking of a purse-seiner ship named Excellent brought the deadly attack to a halt. The sharks vanished beneath the waves as quickly as they had appeared. The crew members of the ship quickly lowered their ladders and rescued the duo from the jaws of death around them. They listened as Barney recounted their harrowing experience before rushing him to the Santa Catalina Island Hospital, where his punctured ankle was stitched. His father was unresponsive and had to be rushed to the intensive care unit. Sadly, the doctors pronounced him dead. An autopsy revealed that there was water in his lungs, confirming drowning as the primary cause of his death. He had already breathed his last before the ocean's deadliest predators launched their attack. Being an old case, the exact species of shark that attacked the two men that day is still unknown. Let us know in the comments what kind of shark you think is responsible for the attack that night, resulting in Dr. Alfred's terrifying final affliction. Sailing the oceans on a luxury yacht sounds like the perfect way to spend a day or two. But what do you do when the yacht gets caught in a severe storm miles from the nearest land? Hopefully, the situation doesn't turn out like it did for Captain John Lippoth and his crewmates. It was a clear, sunny day in October 1982, and Deborah Kiley was excited to complete a job that she had been given. She had been tasked with transporting a luxury 18-meter yacht from Maine to its new billionaire owner in Florida. Deborah was a confident sailor and had even competed in the 70,000-kilometer Whitbread round-the-world race, now called the Ocean Race. She even became the first American woman to complete the event in 1981. The 24-year-old woman was joined on her journey aboard the yacht by a group of her friends. There was the captain of the ship, John Lippoth, his girlfriend, Meg Mooney, and friends Brad Kavanaugh and Mark Adams. The day was perfect for sailing, with clear, bright blue skies. Deborah couldn't have asked for better conditions to set out on the luxury ship. The journey was to take 6 days long and be over 2,000 kilometers, so the group of friends would have plenty of time to enjoy the yacht and simply relax as they sailed to their destination. But things didn't exactly go to plan. 2 days into the journey, the skies above the group of 5 began to darken, and, in the distance, a brewing storm crept ever closer. By nightfall on the second day, the yacht was caught in the middle of a severe and violent tropical storm. The storm was so bad that winds up to 110 kilometers per hour and waves 10 meters high battered the yacht. Deborah had been sleeping in the cabin when the panicked voices of her friends awoke her. Rushing to the deck, the young woman was horrified to see that their captain, John Lippoth, was lying drunk at the wheel of the ship. Immediately, all 5 of the friends began screaming in fear. With the amount of water that was rushing over the yacht, the group knew that the worst possible thing was happening. They were sinking. With no other option, the group of 5 jumped off of the sinking yacht and into the rolling waves below. However, just before Meg was able to escape, she lost her footing and fell into a sharp part of the ship, cutting her legs severely. But with no time to do anything about it, the woman jumped into the water with her friends. Thankfully, Mark had been able to grab an inflatable dinghy, which the terrified group of young men and women clung to as they watched the 18-foot yacht sink beneath the ocean, never to be seen again. Acting quickly, all 5 crew members clambered onto the dinghy, but as Mark pulled himself into the boat, he felt something hard nudge his leg. Once in the safety of the dinghy, the group peered into the dark water below them, where Deborah was just about able to make out the shape of something that looked like a torpedo. Thinking that it was a fish at first, the young woman was horrified to realize what the creature actually was as it swam closer. Swimming just below the surface of the waves were hundreds of sharks. The animals had been drawn to the group as they had smelt the blood seeping from Meg's wound. Hungry and ready for a hunt, the sharks rammed against the dinghy from all directions. All Deborah and her friends could do was hold on to the small life raft and pray that they would make it through the night. As the hours waned on, the storm gradually faded and daylight broke through the darkness of the night. At first, the group of 5 friends were relieved. They believed that they would be able to get to safety in the daylight, as surely someone would be able to spot them in the dinghy. But as the hours passed by and all that Deborah and her friends could see was the never-ending expanse of blue sky and ocean, their hope quickly began to disappear. By the 3rd day of drifting aimlessly in the ocean, the group of 5 friends had no hope at all. Meg's wound had become seriously infected, leaving the young woman dealing with a severe case of blood poisoning. If she wasn't able to get help, and quickly, it was likely that she wouldn't last much longer. As well as that, everyone on the dinghy was starving and unbearably thirsty. And with so much water all around them, it wasn't long before John and Mark decided to brave the salty taste of the ocean and to gulp down as much as they could. The problem with this, though, is that the salt content in seawater is much higher than what can be processed by a human body. And because water is needed to process the salt in the body, it actually leaves the person more dehydrated than before they had a drink. After a few hours, both Mark and John had begun suffering from the side effects of the salt water. The severe dehydration that they were enduring led them to begin to hallucinate. John Lippoth was the first to succumb to his hallucinations. He claimed that he could see land far off in the distance. Unable to persuade him otherwise, the rest of the crew could only watch as their captain dove into the water and began swimming towards the land that only he could see. As the group of four watched John swim away, they all jumped as a scream tore through the air. The blood-curdling scream only lasted for one moment before silence descended once again. Deborah and the rest of the crew knew what had happened. The sharks, which had been lurking underneath them for days on end, had finally gotten their first meal. Horrified, Deborah, Meg, and Brad sat frozen in the dinghy, unsure of what to do next. But Mark was none the wiser. Lost in his own hallucinations, Mark stood up and told the rest of his friends that he needed to run to the store to buy some beer and cigarettes. Then, ignoring the panicked pleading of his friends, he stepped off of the dinghy and into the water. However, this time when the sharks attacked, Deborah and the other two crewmates were able to see a lot more. Because of how close Mark was to the life raft, the rest of the crew were able to feel as the great whites rammed into the boat underneath as they tore apart and bit into Mark. Every bump and rock of the little dinghy had Deborah crying. She could only imagine what was happening beneath her, how the sharks were sinking their 2.5-inch razor-sharp teeth into Mark's body and ripping him apart. The young woman never imagined that something so horrific would happen to her, and she was terrified that she would end up in the same situation as Mark and John. The hours passed by with Deborah, Brad, and Meg lying in the dinghy, full of a faded mixture of urine, pus, and blood from Meg's wound. It was clear that things weren't looking good for the young woman. Her wound had become so infected that her leg had actually started to turn black. Eventually, as the fourth day rolled around, Deborah Kiley and Brad Kavanaugh awoke to find that Meg had passed away from her injury sometime during the night. Now, when people are stuck in extremely difficult situations, it can lead them to think about doing things that would never usually cross their minds. And with how hungry and thirsty he was, Brad couldn't help but contemplate eating Meg's body. It had been 4 days since he had had anything to eat and drink, and the young man knew that he couldn't continue to go on without eating her, or he would surely die too. However, Deborah was able to get him to come to his senses. She told Brad that eating Meg was out of the question. Not only was she their friend, but her infection was so bad that it was likely that it would do more harm than good to cannibalize her. But the two remaining friends also knew that Meg's body couldn't remain in the dinghy with them. Her wound was oozing pus from the infection, and if even a small amount of it got into Brad or Deborah's blood, then they would also become severely ill. With no other option, the two remaining survivors stripped Meg's body of her clothes and jewelry. They wanted to give the young woman's family something to remember her by. Then, after reciting the Lord's Prayer, Deborah and Brad gently pushed the body of their friend overboard. Not wanting to listen to the sharks devouring another one of their friends, Deborah and Brad went straight to sleep. By the 5th day at sea, Deborah and Brad had given up all hope of being rescued. Seeing all of the blood and other bodily fluids in the boat, the pair of survivors decided to try and clean up the dinghy. As Brad was trying to empty the raft, though, a rogue wave suddenly had him tumbling over the side of the boat and into the shark-infested waters below. Panicking, as neither he nor Deborah wanted the sharks to attack again, Brad tried his hardest to clamber back into the dinghy, but with how exhausted and weak he was, Brad was unable to lift himself up. Resigned to his fate, the young man clung onto the side of the raft, waiting for the moment when he would feel the painful bite of one of the sharks. Right at that moment, though, off in the distance, both Deborah and Brad spotted what looked to be a cargo ship. After confirming with each other that it was real and not a hallucination, Brad became reinvigorated. Seeing how close he was to being rescued, the young man managed to haul himself back onto the life raft. Once safely back in the dinghy, Deborah and Brad began yelling as loud as they could for help. After the cargo ship was close enough and had spotted the pair of survivors, they lifted both Deborah and Brad out of the water and onto the safety of the ship. Safely on board, the two survivors learned that they were 140 kilometers south of Cape Lookout. This meant that they drifted almost 150 kilometers off of their original course. But the ordeal wasn't over for the two of them. Those fateful 5 days at sea changed Deborah and Brad's life forever. For years after the incident, Deborah couldn't close her eyes without hearing the screams of her friends as they were eaten by sharks. She went on to write about her ordeal in 2 separate books, whilst also becoming a motivational speaker about surviving against all odds. Sadly, in 2012, at the age of 54, by causes unknown to the public, Deborah also met her final affliction. The following is one of the deadliest shark attacks in recorded history. The terrifying ordeal of this event is the true story behind the 2010 movie, The Reef, which remains one of the most intense and hair-raising shark attack films ever created by Hollywood. It was 1983, and 27-year-old Ray Boundy was living his best life out in the scenic tropical city of Townsville, Australia. Captain of a long trawler boat, he was recognized as a capable and experienced sailor, despite his young age. On July 22nd, he and his crew were making preparations for a shrimp fishing journey on the North Australian coast. He was accompanied by his second captain, 23-year-old Dennis Murphy, and his girlfriend, 21-year-old Linda Horton. They were aware of a particular region of water between Townsville and the Great Barrier Reef, famed for being a great fishing ground. Ray intended on staying a few more weeks just to capitalize on this area that had calm water, slower winds, and plenty of fish. The first 2 days of this endeavor were a joy, filled with relaxation, laughter, and good catch. But it was on the 3rd day that things took a turn for the worse. There was an unexpected high wind in the area. The crew had to make a choice, whether to head back to town, which was still several miles away, or to weather out the storm and wait for it to pass. But many hours had gone by, and the winds showed no signs of slowing down. It was midnight now, and the dark was setting in, compounding their problems. The weather worsened, and the waves started to crash against the boat with great force. It was now that the crew realized their trawler boat had serious internal flooding, and tried as hard as they could to keep it afloat. It was suddenly that Dennis noticed a giant wave hurtling toward them, and with little time for judgment, he jumped off the boat, which capsized after being hit. Ray and Linda, who were too late in noticing the wave, now found themselves trapped under the boat with a small pocket of air to breathe. The two quickly planned on getting out of this predicament by swimming far under to the bottom of the capsized boat and then coming back up from the other side. After resurfacing, the two noticed Dennis not far away and quickly regrouped. The trio started assessing what options they now had, stuck in the middle of the water, with a capsized and drowning boat, which was their only solid ground to stand on between miles of water in every direction. In this distress and confusion, a few hours passed. They were now breathless, tired, and cold. It was Monday, and Ray calculated where they were based on his coordinates. He realized they were at least 95 kilometers from Townsville and 45 kilometers from the closest coral islands. It was obvious that swimming all the way to either side was extremely difficult, but the group quickly realized they didn't have much of a choice. The sinking ship would soon disappear, and they had a few minutes to salvage some things from it before it went down. And so they gathered some items from the shipwreck, tied them together with ropes, and got a surfboard to act as some form of support in the turbulent water. It was a flimsy, makeshift solution, but it was all they had for the 45-kilometer journey to the islands. With no access to drinking water, bearing the scorching heat of daytime, and the grueling physical exertion of constant swimming made them breathless, thirsty, and drained of energy. But they knew the only way was either forward or eventually down into the water. These were prime fishing waters, and this meant that humans weren't the only ones looking to catch them. Sharks were a regular visitor to this area, and encounters with curious sharks was a dangerous, real possibility. An entire day off swimming had passed, and the crew were still at least 30 kilometers from land. Night was now setting in, and the dark quickly engulfed their sight. Then there was some commotion in the water. It wasn't any of the crew. The trio froze and tried not to make sudden movements. They saw a fin in the water, not far from where they were. It was a shark. They didn't know what else to do but to remain still, afloat, and quiet, in hopes that it swims away after a casual encounter. Dennis and Linda were visibly frightened. Their heartbeats were racing and they couldn't control the fear and adrenaline rush. Ray tried to comfort them by whispering how rare shark attacks were and that the curious sharks usually leave humans alone if left unprovoked. At this point, their makeshift life raft had now broken up, and each one of them was now in possession of a small piece that was keeping them afloat. Tiger sharks are only the second largest after great whites, and their size and jaw strength make them one of the most formidable marine predators. They can weigh up to 2,000 pounds, and both their lower and upper jaws have inward-facing teeth, allowing for them to grip and chew off anything or anyone unlucky enough to get in their grip. All of a sudden, Ray felt the touch of the enormous shark beneath him. There was little Ray could do. It was soon after that the shark circled back and bit him on his knee. Ray kicked it with as much force as he could muster, which made the shark relent and swim off. But the shark now had tasted blood, and they knew it was coming back. Panic had now set in, and no one was quiet anymore. All three were now screaming and splashing in the water, desperate for respite from the shark. They were trying frantically to scare off or outrun it, but to no avail. Every time they heard a splash back in the distance, they'd turn their heads, anticipating the shark's comeback. It was hard to spot it underwater. The pitch dark favored the shark and put the helpless crew at a stark disadvantage. It broke the water once again, then just as swiftly disappeared back under. Suddenly, Dennis let out a loud scream in agony. "It's got my leg! The bastard's got my leg!" Ray shouted from afar, imploring Dennis to try kicking it again, but it didn't work as well as it did last time. But now the shark had come to feast and was unwilling to relent or let go of Dennis. Ray and Linda looked on in horror, helpless as Dennis got pulled under and above the water several times before letting go. He was incapacitated and in extreme pain. The water surrounding him resembled a pool of blood, and it was obvious that he was losing blood fast. As Ray and Linda swam up to him, it became clear that Dennis was missing an entire leg, and the profuse bleeding would soon render him unconscious. They tried to use a piece of cloth as a tourniquet in an attempt to stop the blood loss, but it wasn't long before the shark reappeared, not sparing them even a few minutes of respite. Dennis now realized that he could not be saved and that it was best to let himself become the shark's bait, to buy Linda and Ray enough time to escape. Dennis shouted at them to leave without him, and so they started swimming in the opposite direction. There was little time to process the emotion or the gravity of Dennis's sacrifice. All they knew in the moment was that they had to get to safety or his sacrifice would be in vain. They turn around and look at Dennis one last time before he's finally pulled under, never to be seen again. Linda, unable to hold back her emotions, let out cries of helplessness. Ray offered her momentary comfort, but it was clear they had no option but to sustain a steady pace toward the island. 2 hours had passed, and their speed warranted optimism of their survival, but it was short-lived. The shark appeared once again and began circling Ray and Linda in a cynical fashion. The shark took a plunge deep into the water as they were both frozen in fear. All of a sudden, it broke the water surface and this time went straight for Linda, biting into her arms and torso. With a firm grip on her body, the shark shook its head violently from side to side in an attempt to chew off a bite of her before diving back into the water once more. All that was heard from Linda was a light squeal. Her death was swift but painful and in a state of terror. Everything fell dead silent for a moment. Ray was terrified into cold inaction, still trying to fathom the gravity of losing his girlfriend. He then turned around and swam as fast as he could toward the stone reef. His fight and flight response kicked in, and he finally got close to it after a day of swimming. It was a few hundred meters away from shore that the shark resurfaced once again. But Ray noticed an approaching big wave and was able to catch it, using its speed and height to create distance from the shark. He was finally thrown onto the reef, exhausted and severely traumatized. He finally let his emotions go and started to process what had just happened. 27-year-old Ray was discovered the next day at 10 a.m. by an Australian Air Force rescue chopper that had been searching for the crew since they went missing after the storm. Ray went on to become captain of more boats and lived his life as a fisherman. He was never able to fully recuperate from the intense psychological trauma from the nightmare incident, and for long suffered anxiety and PTSD after those grueling 36 hours in the summer of 1983, the day he lost his girlfriend and best friend, narrowly escaping his own terrifying final affliction.